to share some of my research with colleagues and students from Российский государственный университет. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, me and my colleague from Shanghai cannot visit your city, your university personally, but I hope the chances will come up soon for us to see each other, discuss issues of interest, common interest very soon. Today, I'm going to present some ideas on the geographic imagination and the spatial governance in Eurasia, with particular comparison between China and Russia's regional program. The slides and the talk is built on several papers, both policy papers and academic papers I am writing or have just been published. If anyone is interested in more sort of formal format of the articles that I wrote and the talk is built on, you can contact me after the talk. Again, I'd like to show a map first. The map is written in traditional Chinese language, so it may look alien to you, but no matter what, please take a look. And I don't know how many of you can recognize where this the focus of the map is about. Which area does this particular map cover? So I'll pause here for maybe 10 seconds so all of you can take a look. Does anyone want to guess which part of the world is this map covers? You can maybe write it in the chat box. All right, maybe the characters there are not recognizable. This is a map actually presented a few years ago in Taiwan. Most of you probably know the mainland China and Taiwan are still having some dispute political entity, right? But my point of presenting this map is not related to which China this map represents. But you can see probably by now, the map is a map of the part of the Asian continent, east edge of the Asian continent, which also shows part of Russia, Vladivostok, Korea, part of China and Indochina Peninsula. But the focus is obviously on the center is on the island of Taiwan. And Japan is on its left. And then further down on the is the Malaysia, Indonesia, and further into Singapore, right? So this map is very interesting because it was presented by some research institute in Taiwan and was later used by some Taiwan politicians quite often in their political campaign, right? So what does this map tell us, or why do some of the political actors try to use this map to make a point? This is related to our topic today, geographic imagination and the presentation of space, right? Because in this map, one way to read it is Taiwan is not a periphery versus the mainland. It's part of the center in this map. And it's equal distance from Taiwan to the mainland China to Korea to Japan to Philippines to Singapore, Malaysia. So it's rather in the center of a certain parts of the world. It's not attachment to Asia continent. It's not attachment to mainland China. This is just an example to kick off our conversation to show that the way we understand space matters for our political reality. People can use specific presentation and a representation of space to make or support political claims. Right? So this is the way I'd like to kick off our conversation today. So I just see someone wrote in the chat box, Southeast Asia. I think partly that's true. That's true. Thanks for the input. If there's any questions, you can always write in the chat box or raise your hand, and I will maybe stop to address these questions right away. Now, theoretically, I'm building some of my research on you might call critical geography or sociology of space. These are some of the academic disciplines that become quite influential in certain parts of the social science world in the past 3 decades, right? It represents what we call a spatial turn in social science in the past 3 decades. The content of these lines of increase, of course, are very rich, but I will just very quickly highlight a few key basic assumption or starting points. Right? The most important one is, of course, spatial itself is more than a platform for political action. Space itself goes way beyond just as a stage or a platform where political actions or economic actions take place. Right? It's politically important by itself. Space oftentimes is a result of social construction as well as imagination. So it has this material basis, but oftentimes involves a great amount of social construction and imagination. And if we follow that, Eurasia as this concept that are gaining new significance recently. I think our colleagues or audience in Russia is not unfamiliar with this concept. Eurasia has gained a great amount of attention in the past few decades in Russia and more in China too. So a basic assumption for this project is Eurasia is also both a historical, geographic, and geopolitical imaginations. It involves a set of historical, geographic, and geopolitical imaginaries. If we go back to the very early idea of Eurasianism in the Russian context, we can obviously see how imagination plays into the whole process of constructing the idea of Eurasia and why this constructed Eurasia historically has meant so much for example, the Russian Eurasianists, right? But recently, these old imagination about Eurasia, not only in Russia, but also in Iran, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or even in South Korea, as well as in China. These old imaginary have been selectively mobilized or remobilized in political conversation. Some of them become part of the political choice, become a part of the policy choice. Right? So this is what I call the process of remaking Eurasia that has been on the rise in recent decades. And in the past 3 decades, in Russia as well as in sets of country, we have been observed sets of different agents, state, non-state, intellectual, political figures, social movements, research institutes. These different type of agents began to provide and promote a vast array of different narratives or analytical frameworks related to this newly imagined Eurasia. All these narratives involve some sort of new presentation of space in the Eurasian context. Right? So it's probably unexpected back in the early post-Cold War era that we will begin to see such an explosion of imaginary, explosion of so many different imaginaries about this new Eurasia space, And I want to make a point that that kind of explosion of imaginaries of a major region was actually quite unprecedented historically, because in history, that kind of large-scale explosion of imaginary about geography or remaking of space usually comes only after the end of a major war or after the end of a major restructuring of political power, particularly war. But in the case of rise of reimagining Eurasia, these vast array of narratives, diversity of the frameworks related to this new Eurasia was brought about in a rather peaceful context. Right? We didn't see a major war before the rise of these explosion of imaginaries. Right? So I do think we see something quite dramatic and new in that the new post-Cold War context, in the post-Soviet context in particular, really question some of our basic assumptions of how the world is made of, or how the world should arranged spatially and geographically. Right? It challenges a lot of basic assumptions we probably have been used to. Right? So by 2012, these changes, these explosions already developed to such a degree that at one of the keynote speech by the president of American Anthropological Association, a major anthropologist who work on this region in this annual conference, a major academic conference among anthropologists, he actually made this title for his keynote speech, which reads, "We are all Eurasian." Right? That's 2012. And some of my colleagues, Chinese as well as Russian, in 2012, 2013, 2014, published a series of academic and policy papers, more or less try to argue world politics began to witness a so-called Eurasia moment or a Eurasian moment of world politics. Right? So these are just some of the evidence in the intellectual and the policy world that seem to try to make sense and try to make a solid case how important, how politically set this rising new image of Eurasia has been by that time, by the beginning of the second decades into the 21st century. Right? So how to explain, how to make sense of the diversity of different type of spatial imagination, spatial presentation. Right? This is what I'm going to do in this talk, as well as what I've been trying to do in some of my researches. Right? So I started from a basic idea that drawing upon sociology, political sociologies. So any society consists of fundamental sources of social power. Social power, and these different social powers, or the combination of these different social powers, has a very direct spatial meaning or spatial visions, right? Or, for example, political power or state power tends a boundary-centric idea of space.
Прошу прощения, как связь? Как слышно?
Слышно нормально.
У вас
Все
слышно.
хорошо слышно?
А профессора сейчас не слышно, да, больше?
Нет, не слышно.
Он вылетел?
Да, вот он. Сейчас, секунду, проверю. Угу. Его... А, нет, он есть в списках. Он есть.
Он переподключился только что.
Угу.
So I'm very sorry, the connection was down for a while. I don't know where I was stopped. So very sorry for that. I think it's probably the connection on my side. I should have tested that before. I think the university connections, when there are too many people logged in, becomes very unstable. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Sorry, I don't know where I was stopped. This is some of the slides I just ran over. Just try to make a point that since the end of Cold War, there have been a vast array of new imagination about Eurasia, and the diversity was really unprecedented. And then I tried to make sense of this diversity of imagination about Eurasia from a political sociology perspective, right? So different social power tends to demand a different type of spatial visions, spatial vision. So political power, state power, tends to demand to master a boundary conscious space. Political power demands a space idea with a very clear boundary. Economic power in modern days, political capital power, tends to constantly demand for mobility, right? Because capital knows no boundary, try to flow anywhere, everywhere, right? But in some cases, economic power or capital power also need what in the political sociology literature called fixity, right? It needs fixity in order to realize its capital accumulation. So that's the starting point of my analysis. Later you will see I try to explain different type of imagination based on how each country represents a fundamental different type of social power. Right? So that's my theoretical starting point. Now, if I may turn to China for a while. So China, on the most macro level, from early 1980s, started from a world system, started from what I might call a semi-peripheral status, right? And in the past 4 decades, the national economy tries very hard to catch up with the central or core countries in the international system, particularly the United States. This economic catch-up so far has been relatively successful, right? We see the massive expansion of production in China and the overall improvement of individual and family livelihood over time. But since, roughly speaking, mid or late 1990s, the Chinese economy also began to show serious signs of so-called over-accumulation. There's a lot of overproduction in some of the traditional economic sectors, like steel, like the production of cement, construction material, etc. Right? And for each unit of capital gains, the national economy needs more and more capital injection. That's a very typical sign of a mature capitalist economy, what we call overaccumulation. So one way to sort of address this overaccumulation, to keep the national economy on the, to continue this circle of accumulation and expansion, is to adjust the spatial dimension of domestic accumulation. To continue this capital accumulation and expansion on a completely new spatial dimension, new spatial vision. Right? That's in the geography literature. Sometimes it's called a spatial fix. Spatial fix. So the Chinese economy entered a new stage by late 1990s to try to sort of expand its economy on a new global dimension as a way to introduce this spatial fix for its domestic capital. Right? So from 1997, for example, we first hear this idea of go abroad, to the state try to encourage domestic business to go outside of China, to go to where there are still opportunities to make profits. So that was the early version of global vision of the Chinese economy back in 1997, go abroad. And then that kind of calculation culminated in later what was called the One Belt and One Road, either OBOR or later Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Right? So the whole idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, at least from the official narrative, is to establish so-called hyper connectivities along mostly the Europe-Asia continent, running from East Asia through Central Asia, Afghanistan, Turkey, Russia, a large space of former Soviet space, all the way to Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, to the so-called older Europe. And to get this whole vast space connected, and then let economic resources, factor of endowment to run smoothly over this hyper-connected space, right? In order to sustain domestic economic growth, sustain domestic capital accumulation and expansion. So I wrote that in more detail in one paper that I published in 2017 with more data, with more analysis, but the gist of the argument is already on this slide. Right? So that's the driving force. In other words, among these fundamental social power, I argue China in the past 4 decades is predominantly utilizing economic power as its fundamental social foundation. As a consequence for that kind of economic structural changes, we began to see a set of interesting new spatial vision, particularly evident through the representation of Belt and Road Initiative. Right? In other words, the Belt and Road Initiative, through its spatial representation, indicate or demonstrate this shifting grand spatial, new spatial visions held by Chinese intellectuals, held by Chinese political elites. Now, if we may pause for a while to look at some of the BRI maps as sort of a spatial representation. Now, this is one of the very early map we see from the Chinese sources. It was made by the Xinhua News Agency. Actually, Chinese state agency that run this project, like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Ministry of Finance or the National Commission on Economic Development Reform, have never issued any so-called official Belt and Road Initiative map. So what we have are all kinds of semi-official or non-official maps. But the interesting thing is their spatial representation are strikingly similar. Right? So I'll show a few maps. So this is one of the very early maps we see to represent China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is from the Xinhua News Agency. Right? So take a look if you're interested. And you might ask yourself, what's interesting about this kind of map or the spatial representation in this map, right? Now, as time goes by, we see more and more new maps coming up. This is a map made by, I think it's made by Kommersant, by one of the Russian major newspaper, right? So this is what they believe is involved in the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. So you can take a look and see maybe there's some interesting similarity, parallel, and maybe interesting difference between this one and the first one. And the third map, I think it's by some European think tank, right? So that's a more recent map. The last one is made by a Hong Kong-based business consulting company. That's their map of Belt and Road Initiative, the 65 countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is just a very small selection of the various kinds of maps I and my co-author collect since 2014 until 2020. These maps are made by Chinese agencies, non-Chinese agencies, sometimes by individuals, sometimes by research institutes, sometimes by think tank or even business entity. Some are made by news agency, media, right? So we collect more than 60 different maps, but overall we see a striking level of similarity. Right? The color might be different, the captions might be different, but we do see strikingly strong similarities across these 60 strong maps. Right? So what are the spatial representations among these vast array of different maps? Right? I'm not sure. When I show the maps, you notice that. Maybe some of you already noticed that. Oh, can you see the screen right now?
No, we don't see a screen demonstration.
My bad. How about now?
Yes, now we see.
Okay, I'll quickly run back. Can you see?
Yes.
All right. So this is the sort of a theoretical foundation. See, different social power has different spatial visions. This is a quick summary of the argument I'm making. China went through a catch-up in its grand economic development, but was stuck with over-accumulation since the late 1990s, and then began to try to reconfigure its economic strategy on a new spatial dimension. And that's why we began to see new representation of a global space, particularly through these Belt and Road Initiative. So then I show a few different maps. Again, if you cannot see the slides, stop me right away. So I'll adjust share the screen. So this is one of the very first BRI maps made by Xinhua News Agency. Take a quick look. This is one made by Russian newspaper, Kommersant. Again, this is a map made by I think some European policy think tank. Right? The last one is a map made by a Hong Kong-based business consulting firm. I've collected many maps on Belt and Road Initiative, and the finding we reach is there's a striking level of similarities across these different maps made by different agencies. So what we try to highlight is some of the commonalities in BRI spatial representations are listed here. So on this slide, for example, this is not a world map. In almost all these maps, the Americas are not represented at all. The Americas are not represented at all. Right? It's mostly Europe, Asia continent, plus part of Africa. Most maps do not include Australia or New Zealand either. Right? And as a result of that, China itself is usually not in the center. Right? Like this map or this map, you can see the center of the map, gravity of attention is somewhere in Central Asia or Afghanistan or Iran or even the Caspian Sea, etc. Right? But obviously, China is not in the epicenter of this map, right? Eurasia continent, in almost all these maps are presented as a vast open plain land space, because there's no indication of, for example, mountains, major rivers are oftentimes dismissed. Most importantly, in almost all these maps, traditional national boundaries are either blurry or very much downplayed, Like here you see traditional boundaries are there, but the national boundaries are very blurry. It's not highlighted, right? Or if you look at this map, almost no state boundaries are clearly demonstrated. Particularly the part, northern part, what we look at is just a vast open space. And so in that sense, Eurasia is presented as a vast open, also flat space. What's actually highlighted are those dots, lines, stripes, right? Dots, lines, stripes. This one is particularly illustrated. We can take a look at what's actually highlighted there, if not traditional national boundaries or geographic features like a major river, high mountains, right? So what's actually highlighted in this kind of map is the dots, lines, stripes. The dots are usually production center, major transportation hub, Irkutsk, Astana, Ulaanbaatar, right? Tashkent, etc. Or the lines are the major transportation infrastructure lines, either high-speed rail or major maritime transportation line, either finished in operation or most likely in preparation. Okay? Or on top of that, what you see highlighted is these stripes, which are some of the major so-called corridors. And in terms of that, there's a great amount of similarities here, right? Dots, lines, this map doesn't have very clear stripes, but the dots and lines are equally highlighted. Right? So in other words, this typical BRI map presents Eurasia continent as a widely open flat space connected through all these different type of infrastructure projects, either on the land route or on the maritime route. So if you believe back in the early 1990s, the catchphrase from America to describe the world at that time is so-called the world is flat. The world is flat. So in these maps related to BRI, maybe one began to see the rise of a connected world. The connected world expressed most strongly in the Eurasia continent. Now, if these BRI map shows the contemporary spatial imagination particularly by Chinese elites, we can see a clear contrast between these maps and the spatial imagination with historical maps in the past. Now, this is an old day map to indicate the imperial period, pre-20th century imperial China. And that kind of map, this is of course a modern reproduction, a simplified modern reproduction, but it does show some of the key features of imperial time, so the world vision, spatial vision in ancient pre-modern imperial time China. So the typical feature in those kind of map is what, right? There's a very limited representation of world, and in this small world, China or imperial China sits right in the center. And then there is a layer of relations between the central power and the so-called peripheral regions. So imperial China had this spatial visions, imagining spatially, there's also a concentric circles of civilization, right? The closer you get to the civilizational center in Beijing, in imperial China center, the closer you are to the civilizational core. So you're part of us. The further away you're from the civilizational center, then you're more peripheral, or even to the extent that you are so far away, you were regarded as barbarians. You're not part of a civilization sphere of imperial China. So that was the sort of spatial vision. Spatial. It can very often demonstrated in imperial maps. Imperial map, you can see the closer to the imperial center, the boundaries are usually depicted with more detail. The further away you go from the imperial center, there tend to be much less details about these peripheral stage, because the civilizational center in Beijing just don't care. And there's obviously very clear hierarchy of spatial representation. So this is vastly different from what you see in these contemporary modern day maps, spatial representations by these BRI maps. Right? So I would argue through these spatial representation via BRI maps, we began to see the rise of new sets of fundamentally different spatial imagination by Chinese elites through Belt and Road Initiative. They look at predominantly Eurasia continent as a vast open space that's ready for economic forces to run through these infrastructural connectivity mechanism. And the Eurasia continent is a vast open space, no clear boundary. The Belt and Road Initiative itself does not have a clear boundary either. And so far, this kind of spatial imagination tried to exclude Americas from its world vision, right? So that's China. Now next, I try to go over quickly the Russian case. I argue Russian predominantly is a political power in the past, political military power in the past post-Soviet world. As a consequence, when it tried to mobilize its own Eurasian vision, it presents a much more state-centric, boundary-conscious idea of Eurasia integration. And also, that kind of political vision of Eurasia integration demands a very clear institutional format. Right? So Russia has made an initiative to several major regional integration organizations. These initiatives all come with a very clear institutions with a clear organizational format, whether it's CSTO or the more recent Eurasia Economic Union, or the potential Russia-Belarus Union, right? It demands a very clear institutional foundation. The Belt and Road Initiative, in contrast, is like water flowing through a flat platform, flat space, did not insist on a clearly defined institutional format. Right? So that creates a very different Eurasia spatial representation. Again, state power-centric, boundary conscious, and then there tends to be a internal hierarchy, internal hierarchy. That, if you buy my argument, later we will see, creates difficulty in the coordination between these two different spatial imaginaries, between more specific, the Chinese proposed Silk Road economic road, and the Russia proposed Russia leading Eurasia Economic Union, because these two are very different spatial representing different type of power projection over the so-called Eurasia space. You know, I was trying to find a Russian version of Eurasian map. Actually, surprisingly, there's very little available. This is not the best map. This is not about the Eurasia Economic Union, but one spatial representation of a Eurasianist world vision. But I think conveys the kind of a message on the previous slide. It still conveys a somewhat clear boundary conscious hierarchical spatial imagination related to the Eurasian idea in contemporary Russia. Right? If you know or you see any credible map about Russia's Eurasian either Eurasian Economic Union or more generally Russian Eurasianist spatial imagination, any map around that line, I would very much appreciate if you can send it to me. Now, these different visions tend to create quite a bit trouble these days in coordinating the Russian vision and the Chinese vision of Eurasia. That partly explains why from 2015, when the two states made it a very strong, made it a policy priority to conjugate, right? To conjugate or coordinate between these two regional integration plan. Up until now, I think the consensus in the policy world is, despite the political will on the top level, from the top leaders level, so far the conjugation or the coordination between EAEU and the BRI or the Silk Road has been very limited. Progress have been made not between the two grand regional initiatives. The visible progress were mostly made between on a bilateral level, and mostly were driven by previously existing agreement. In other words, the very limited progress we see in coordination actually has nothing to do with coordination, has little to do with coordination. So my argument is the slow pace of coordination between EAEU and the China proposed Silk Road plan is predominantly because the mismatch between two different type of spatial vision, right? For example, China's spatial vision is ideally we get this whole east-west bound of east-west direction of Eurasia continent connected and let goods and services to run over the space as soon as possible all the way to Europe. That's a direct implication for the flat-flowing Eurasian space for China. But Russia has a quite different idea. It would rather to have goods and services go through first predominantly through its own Trans-Eurasia railway, right? And then in many cases, it wants the goods and services to actually stay in the local context a little bit longer, so that things or the related services can more be embedded in the regions that the flow of goods and services runs through, like the Siberia for Far East area. Right? So that's why you see two different ideas of how to utilize the connectivity of the space. Right? Let's just give you one example. Now I think I need to speed up a little bit. But what are some of the consequences of this different spatial imagination about Eurasia? And what are the potential political challenges it creates? Right? On the Chinese side in particular, one of the intended consequences is this vast open Eurasian land space actually unexpectedly creates a fundamental challenge in China's self-identity. Right? Because historically, China has a relatively clear civilizational core. It's a predominantly Han-centered civilizational core, right? So when this open up to the open Eurasian space become politically salient, we recently actually see somewhat unexpected this debate on whether the Chinese civilization has a so-called inner Asianness, whether you can call Chinese civilization, at least part of its core is what we might call inner Eurasia. Inner Eurasia geographically obviously involve at least part of today's Mongolia, Central Asia, part of today's Russia, and even more so to the west and the southwest. Right? So that actually creates some challenges. To address the fundamental civilizational question: who are we? Who are the Chinese? When you open up this spatial imagination, right? I don't know if you're sensitive to that, right? Is that the kind of China you would associate with? This is from a super popular TV series about some of the young members in the Qing dynasty royal family. It's very super popular. But is that really China, some people would say, because this is the last imperial dynasty, Qing dynasty. The ruling class was Manchu, right? They're not ethnic Han. And their hairstyle, the kind of costume they introduced was not a typical Chinese or Han component, right? That creates even more challenge when German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited China, I think 2014 or maybe 15. She went to Shenyang, the former capital city of the Manchu dynasty before they moved to Beijing. Right? So the local government present a vast show, a gala, to welcome this distinguished guest from Germany. What they end up presenting is a supposed royal welcoming reception ceremony in the style of the Qing dynasty. Right? When this show was presented, it actually caused unexpectedly a big sprawl in the Chinese public space. A lot of people question, well, for this distinguished European guest, don't we have more authentic Chinese things to present to her, to Merkel, right? Is this the kind of China we would love to present to the German Chancellor, right? So this is just one example to see how the open up of new space creates actually unexpected challenges to even the basic national identity. Now, next, very quickly on some of the key issues, the contradictions we see in newly rising Eurasian imagination. I'll run through them a little bit faster. And also these issues of contradiction are not only related to China or Russia. So there are a lot of, you might call it flawed or misleading historical metaphors in the new Eurasian imagination, right? For example, a lot of Chinese use of a historical metaphor about Silk Road always emphasize the Silk Road starts from the east edge of Asia continent and run all the way to the west, to the north. This is actually fundamentally wrong. Historically, that was absolutely not correct, right? Not correct, right? To try to highlight the new China-centric, East Asia-centric origin of Silk Road, which was actually historically not right? And a lot of discussion about geographic crossroad are automatically equated as economical or political core, right? So a lot of people make this kind of argument, right? A certain city, certain micro region, because they're geographically in some of the central space, or they are centered to a transportation route, then automatically they would draw the conclusion these cities, these hubs are economic or political core. And then I think that equation cannot be drawn so easily, right? And in the Chinese, particularly in the Chinese vision of hyper-connectivity, it only emphasized the positive consequence. People can win from better connectivity through equal cooperation on equal footing. Sometimes this is even called the new so-called spirit, right? Win-win through connectivity. But it downplays its potential negative consequences. But don't forget, because the neoliberal globalization in the past 3 decades essentially asks a similar type of connectivity too, even though it's the emphasis on physical connectivity is different. But the idea of let economic factor flow freely around the world to grasp any potential profits in a neoliberal world vision can be seen as something very similar to the new Silk Road, right? So whether there is fundamental difference or they are actually fundamentally the same, I think this is not a well-articulated point yet, and it's used in a lot of the Silk Road metaphor, right? Overall, whether this romantic, depoliticized imaginary of Eurasia, whether the Russian version or Chinese version or the Kazakh or Iran version, whether this is supposedly postmodern practice in essentially increasingly modern political landscape, which involves huge geopolitical confrontation and conflict. Right? This is also a disputable point. Right? Right? Now I just show some interesting maps and photos. This is one of the promotional pamphlet about Kazakhstan. Right? It sets Kazakhstan at the crossroad of the world in the center of Eurasia, right? Some of you might have seen that kind of promotion material for Kazakhstan in different contexts. This is a policy report about Georgia. And then the title also mobilized this idea. Georgia is in somewhat the center of Eurasia to help reconnect Eurasia. That makes Georgia geographically significant, right? And this is the logo for Astana. Some of you might have taken airplanes with that airline. So their logo is from the heart of Eurasia, right? But you might wonder how many hearts are there in Eurasia, because this is a map. This is one of the scenes in a documentary film made by Channel 1, Первый канал, in Russia. This is screen cropped. I made when I watched this movie on Aeroflot flight to Moscow. Right? So Russia and China center of Eurasia. So again, where is the center of the heart of Eurasia, and how many hearts actually can Eurasia host? And where is exactly Russia, China, or Kazakhstan in this vast land of Eurasia? So these are, again, some of the interesting, tricky questions, potential tensions and challenges in this newly rising geographic imaginary, exciting but also messy imaginary in this new Eurasia space, right? So I'll stop here. Sorry for the technical problem. I hope the second half of the presentation goes smoothly. And here is my email address. Any comments or questions are more than welcome. And also I'm on multiple academic or social media platforms. You can find some of my academic policy works on like a Google Scholar or Academia EDU, and feel free to connect it on an individual basis through these different platforms. Okay, I'll stop here. Any question or comments are more than welcome. Thank you.